experiment. I left my laptop in the bag. I'm going to present on the Mac using Office web apps here, so this will be fun. So we're hoping that connectivity works well. But this deck is actually up on my SkyDrive, so I will post a link to this on the Meetup after the Meetup, so you can go and check it out afterwards as well. A couple of things I want to point out. There's the stack of cards that are over there by the raffle box. Those are contact cards for me specifically. I am local here in the DC area. I've been a part of this community since 1997. They are not going to Microsoft Corporate. They are not going in some database somewhere. They are something where I can communicate with you if you say yes, to let you know about stuff that's going on that I'm doing in terms of talks or workshops or events or things like that. Totally optional. If all you want to do is put your name on there to get in the raffle, that's fine too, right? So totally up to you. Did want to throw out a question. Is there anybody in the room who has built an app for either the Windows Store or for Windows Phone? You have one in the store? Okay. 4,000 Xbox Live points to you.
How about?
I reward people when they do good stuff. So
how about build it but have not published it?
So do you have it handy here? If you can show me here, I'll give you a card. Yes?
What if I designed it for the company I work for, and it's in the store?
And it's in the store or not in the store?
In the store.
If it's in the store, you know what? I'll give you credit. I like designers too, so. All right, I have a confession to make. I'm a developer. So please don't throw stuff at me. I'm really a nice guy, even though I'm a developer. But tonight, I want to talk to you about design, specifically Microsoft design. So my information is up here. My blog is at devhammer.net. By the way, the design of my blog is a template, so don't look at it and cry. It's one of those things where if anybody wants to volunteer to help me update it and make it look prettier, I'd be happy to help. Like I said, I'm a developer. My Twitter handle is at devhammer. There is a story behind devhammer. If anybody's interested, I can tell you afterwards, but I'm not going to take up the time for that right now. All right. So the main thing I want to focus on, we'll probably kind of breeze through the second half of the talk just so that I don't eat up anybody else's time. But the first part of the talk, I want to talk about some of the background and design and principles that came into what we call Microsoft design. And we'll talk a bit about the design principles specifically for Windows 8. So the two words Microsoft and design might not be the most intuitive to find together, but I hope that by the end of the talk you'll understand that Microsoft has actually been, for many years, putting increased focus on design as a really critical part of the software that we deliver to our customers. So when we talk about Microsoft design or the Windows 8 design style, there are a number of influences behind that. There are three that are pretty key, however. The first is the idea of modern design, which came out of the Bauhaus, and we'll talk a little bit more specifically about that. The second, international typographic style, which is also sometimes referred to as Swiss design. And then the third, motion design and cinematography. All these are kind of influences on the design style that is implemented in Windows 8 and Windows RT. So when we talk about the Bauhaus, right? The Bauhaus, this is a picture of one of the Bauhaus schools from Wikipedia. The Bauhaus was really sort of a response to kind of ornamented design styles, things that had a little bit too much, if you will, from kind of the decorative standpoint. If you think maybe styles like, for example, Art Deco, right, a very kind of flashy and decorative style. Bauhaus was really a response to that, which had the idea of kind of reducing things to their essence, right? Take away everything except what is essential to a given object, whether it's a building or a chair or whatever else. Strip it down to its essence, but make it beautiful, right? So bringing things down to just the very core. So another example of this is, oops, I've one too many here. Sorry about that. There we go. So an example of this is the very kind of austere table and chair look. Right? That's a very Bauhaus look. Then the idea behind the Bauhaus came out of a lot of changes in society, right? So the Industrial Revolution brought many changes to the world. there were a lot of advancements in technology that brought parts of the world closer together. So things were changing rapidly in society. People in businesses were more connected. And all of these things kind of came together at a time when those folks who were building, whether it was buildings and architects, whether it was furniture, were kind of really still stuck in the kind of previous world and concepts. And we're seeing a lot of those same things happen in today's society. Right? The internet has really kind of shrunk the world even more than air travel and radio and telephone did in previous generations. So taking the inspiration from modern design and from Bauhaus just kind of made sense. So we think about the international typographic style. Sometimes we refer to this as wayfinding. The idea that you can really, again, distill things down to the essential pieces and use bold typography as a way of effectively communicating very, very quickly just the critical and important information. So we think particularly around travel scenarios, right? Trying to find where you're going in an airport. The signage in airports are all designed very specifically so that you can gather the information that you need to get where you're going quickly. Because how many of us actually really get to the airport as early as they say we should? Very few of us, right? We're almost always in a hurry. We've got to get to our gate before the plane leaves. So it's really critical that we be able to communicate, that this information be communicated quickly and effectively. Train stations have some of the same kinds of information. Right? Bold typography, very readable, very easy to get that information at a glance. And again, just kind of the bold signage, the arrows, the iconography. So all of these are things that we took as inspiration in the design of Windows 8 to, again, allow people to very quickly gather the information that they need to know what they're doing with a given icon or a given set of text. And hierarchy is also important, right? One of the things that you saw in one of the earlier pictures is the idea that you've got multiple sizes of text, and those sizes of text imply a hierarchy of information. And then, of course, subways are another great example of this. All right, so why the idea of Swiss design? Again, cleanliness, right? Not over-decorated, not having chrome and other ideas kind of obscure the most important parts of what your interface is looking like. Right? Rather than having things where we have a bunch of lines and containers and these things to kind of separate information, we use hierarchies, we use bold color, we use contrast as a means of providing that distinction between parts of a given user interface or hierarchies of information. Again, typography is a really important part of this. Another important part that's implemented in the Windows 8 applications is the idea of the grid. Right? So working from grid, and we'll talk about that in a little bit here. And then again, bold, flat color. Gradients tend to obscure. Flat color makes it easier to have the things that are important pop. And then the other thing is bright, bold photography. So full bleed images are something that you're going to see frequently in the Windows 8 style. And then the next concept is sort of the idea of emotional impact through motion. So if we think about some of the categories of this, one of the early folks who did a lot of work around this, you go and find the trailer for North by Northwest or The Man with the Golden Arm. These are examples of where motion brings a lot of emotional impact. You can also see this in some of the opening credits for various movies. How many of you have seen the movie Catch Me If You Can? Right? Really great example of emotional impact through motion. One of the other great examples of that, how many of you have seen Star Wars? Right? Star Wars opens with a black screen, right? Take yourself back there. Star Wars opens with a black screen, and then you hear the fanfare, and you get and then you get the text creeping up. And so you get that broad fanfare, and you get the trumpets blaring, and you've got the storyline laying out before you, and you're beginning to be taken on an emotional journey, right? That opening credits is probably, it's probably one of the most memorable credits in movie history. And it's not just because of the credits itself, but it's also because of the emotional impact of the movie that follows. Right? So the content is important, but how you kind of lead in is also important as well. You can also do a search on YouTube for kinetic typography, another influence in this particular area. So that's sort of the background and the influences. I'm going to move on here a little bit. Now, we kind of drop back to the conceptual. The idea behind modern design is really reduce our interfaces to the essence. Right? Pull back from the decorative, reduce the amount of unnecessary chrome, things like lines and separation and boxes, and really kind of bring the interface down to its essence. The typographic style really is about clarity of information, again using text and fonts and typography for communicating hierarchies of information. And then motion design is the idea of playfulness and animation and bringing that interface to life. Right? So we'll see examples of that as well. All right, so before I get into some of the kind of details of these design principles, I want to kind of walk through sort of where the design in Microsoft came from. You might want to shield your eyes for some of this if you're queasy, or you become queasy easily. So we had Windows Mobile. Lots of gradients, lots of sort of skeuomorphic icons. Yeah, so not pretty. The old Xbox 360 dashboard, not necessarily a terrible interface, but that's where that sort of started. Windows 7, again, not necessarily bad or ugly, but very much a sort of glossy and lots of kind of decoration going on. Now, how did we get from there to Windows 8? Well, one of the places where the design style that became Windows 8 first showed up is in Windows Media Center. Windows Media Center is based on what's referred to as the twist interface. The idea behind Windows Media Center was to give a PC the ability to do what we would call a 10-foot experience. Right? You're 10 feet away from the screen. It's a big screen. You're not using a mouse and a keyboard. Right? It's not an interface that's designed for that. It's an interface that's designed for using a remote. You've got a four-way. You've got a button in the middle. Right? So the twist interface says up, 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 side, 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 click. Right? It's for that kind of input device. It's really an optimized interface for working with that. But notice the use of bold typography, right? And yes, there are gradients in here, but the text is really denoting some of the hierarchy in terms of your up and down are your categories, and then your side to side. And notice the uppercase versus lowercase are the individual selections in a given category, right? So again, the text is communicating that hierarchy. We don't need to have a bunch of boxes around to show that this is a hierarchy. It's just communicated in a little more clear way. The Zune and Zune HD, right? The Zune, widely kind of chuckled and laughed at in terms of its sales success, but in terms of design, it really carried through some of the very same concepts that came out of Windows Media Center. Again, the use of bold typography as sort of a first-class citizen for denoting the hierarchy of information. The Zune HD in particular, when I first got this, I mean, forget for now the industrial design of the device itself. When I first picked up my Zune HD and started playing with it, one of the things that I noticed immediately was that the tiles in the background there were another way of accessing things like recently played songs, recently used apps, things like that. When you moved the device around, it had an accelerometer in it, and there was a very subtle movement between the items that were in the background and the items in the foreground that communicated that, hey, these are two levels of the same stuff, and if I tapped on the background tiles, it would swap. Right? So there was a very subtle but playful animation there that communicated additional information without necessarily having to have a bunch of arrows or instructions saying, here, you need to do this to get to this information. The Zoom for Windows client, again, the typography and the text, the photography, there's not a lot of lines around here kind of collecting various parts of the information. It's communicated based on headings, based on text. It's easy to figure out which things go with which. The other nice thing in the Zoom for Windows client is you could go full screen while playing songs, and it would give you nice imagery from the given artist or band that you were playing, give you information about the songs that you were playing, the playlist, and if I played this and then kind of left it alone for a while, all that information goes away, and what I get is bio information and things like that streaming across the screen. Because again, if I'm just sitting here, if I'm playing this and and I'm working on something else, I don't necessarily need to have all of this information in front of me full time. But if I move my mouse or touch something or whatever, that information then comes back. Right? So not having all of the stuff in your face all at the same time. All right, so we want to do a quick tour of some of the design principles behind Windows 8 app design. There are 5 basic principles. Do more with less, pride and craftsmanship, be fast and fluid, authentically digital, and win as one. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. So when we talk about pride and craftsmanship, we're talking about the concepts of typography and the grid. When we talk about fast and fluid, we're talking about the idea of motion and kind of providing a starting point and ending point between when we transition between parts of our UI, whether that be screens in an app or whether that be different elements. The idea of touch and ergonomics. Authentically digital really speaks powerfully to the idea that we don't need to pretend that we're something other than we are. It's the idea of being comfortable with letting a pixel be a pixel. Right? That this is a digital interface. We're in an age where we can maybe move past some of the more representative design choices. Doing more with less, again, back to the idea of let's kind of, as much as possible, strip away the chrome and let our content be what dictates the design. And then win as one comes down to a UI model that is designed around the idea of simplicity. So we have the idea in Windows 8 of these charms. There's a settings charm, a share charm, a search charm. And these are one-stop shops for all of the apps that you might want to do those things in. Right? So any app can use the settings charm to locate their settings and preferences. So the user always knows where to go when they want to find settings for a given app. The user always knows where to find share for a given app, etc. So I think I want to drill mostly into kind of the discussion of the grid on this briefly. So the idea of the grid is we start off with a unit of 20 by 20 pixels, and then we kind of break the screen up into multiples of units. The idea behind this is you can then determine, based on the number of units, for example, a header text would typically be within the first 7 units, so the first 140 pixels. And then the content region would be below that. Now, the grid, one of the things that people sometimes worry about when you kind of bring up the idea, well, you should respect the grid or you should align to the grid, is that, okay, but I don't want to get stuck in these rigid boxes and not have the ability to be creative. Now, the templates that we have out of the box, so for example, if you use the grid app template, well, what you get out of the box is a grid of gray squares. But that's not what you're limited to. Particularly, my favorite way of building apps on Windows 8 is using HTML and JavaScript. And anything that you can do in terms of CSS and creativity, you can use rounded corners, you can make circles and other shapes and all kinds of things, and still align those objects to the grid. Right? You can do things where you have a sort of stock size and then multiples of that stock size. For example, here, I've got 3 square tiles, and then I've got 2 tiles that are 3 times the width of the base size. Right? So you have the flexibility to do whatever kind of stuff you want to do. In this case, what I've got is a very small size tile, and then I have multiples of that. So you can really kind of go wild in terms of how you want to leverage the grid. But using the grid as a basic way of designing sort of the silhouette of an app one of the nice things about having apps with very similar silhouettes, not necessarily of the content, but of where the various items land on the screen, is that it makes it easier for users to understand, oh, hey, I've seen this before. I know how to use this. If you think back to, say, the origins of Windows 95, right? In Windows 95, there were UI guidelines about, for example, menus. Right? If you had a file menu, it needed to be the far left menu, and it was usually where your close or exit command landed. So people always knew how to close apps. If you had a help menu, it was always on the far right, and if you had an about command, it went in the help menu. So people always knew how to find that. So the ability to use the idea of silhouettes and the grid to bring that same familiarity to users is a powerful way of bringing your app into the ecosystem here in such a way that people just understand from the get-go how to use it. And that's not to say that your app has to be identical with other apps, but it means that your app fits in with that ecosystem. Now, typically apps will have, particularly like the apps that are leveraging the grid, will have a left margin of 6 units or 120 pixels. Now, the reason for that is that the typical scrolling pattern for a Windows 8 app is scrolling from right to left. So by having that sort of gutter on the left and then the content bleeding off to the right edge, it gives the user the clue that, okay, I'm going in this direction to get to the rest of the content. Right? The overlap on the other edge kind of makes that clear. And so you can see I've got my left margin, and then I've got some of my content is bleeding off the screen. Right? And that just kind of speaks powerfully without necessarily having UI affordances that there's more content to be seen there. All right, so, and you can also see some of the concepts in terms of type ramps. Now we have built into all of our templates light and dark styles, both in CSS land and also in XAML. And so they have a built-in type ramp based on the idea of page headers, subheaders, so that types of information are dictated based on the size of the text. So again, that kind of gives you that use of typography for communicating hierarchy. All right, so in terms of fast and fluid, one of the things that's really important on Windows 8 and Windows RT in particular is the idea of touch. And we focused really hard on designing a system that makes for a really good touch experience. What you're seeing here is a heat map that's generated based on a database of information that Microsoft purchased from the US military, of all places. Apparently the US military has spent decades, and I suppose by measuring all of the body parts of soldiers as they come into the service, and putting that into a database. And so this database helps to understand how big are people's thumbs, how long are they, where can they reach on the screen, right? And so by mapping that onto a device, okay, if I'm holding a device on the sides and moving around, where can I reach comfortably? This is an important thing to consider when you're designing an app. Right? So one of the things that you'll find is that our recommendations for an app bar, right? The app bar is where you would have app commands down at the bottom of the screen or the top of the screen. The recommendation is that you have those buttons for the app bar to the left or right side, not dead center. Because if it's dead center, it's really hard to reach, right? So the ability to reach and easily touch items on the screen with thumbs, if that's how somebody's holding the device, is just one of those considerations around the idea of being fast and fluid. Again, authentically digital really speaks to concepts about being connected to the cloud constantly, the use of typography, motion. But the other thing is, these are icons from a previous version of Windows. They're very, very skeuomorphic, right? The calculator looks like a calculator. The notepad even has sort of a clear cover on it. These are things that there was a time when it was really important for icons and ideas in an operating system to be skeuomorphic because there were lots and lots of people who had never used a computer before and really kind of needed that bridge from the real world concept to the digital concept. You have to kind of question whether that's fully necessary today. And I know it's a big debate, and there are some people who still love skeuomorphic, and I'm not going to beat up on anybody for that. But the idea here is that we go from icons to, in Windows 8, the idea of these live tiles. And live tiles are about, again, using bold color, typography, photography, and motion to communicate more information than an icon alone can communicate. So we use motion to allow you to do things like, for example, updates. Right? So the live tiles can take updates from the cloud, they can take updates from local apps, they can cycle updates, and they can communicate repeatedly the information that's important to you from the various apps that are represented by these tiles. And the beautiful thing is, if you design an app with a great live tile, you do two things for your users. One is, you give them information that's important to them without them having to open your app, and potentially you entice them to actually open your app more frequently. Right? So you get more use of your app, you get more information to your user. Happy, happy. Doing more with less, if you take away one point from the idea of do more with less, it's really be great at something. There are a lot of apps out there that try to do everything under the sun. And some of them do some things well, and the more things that they try to do, typically they don't do a whole lot of things really well. One of the ways that we communicate this in some of the design sessions we do with people is we say, write out, before you even set pen to paper to start designing your app, write out a best at statement. Right? My app is the best at blank in its category. Right? Choose what your best at statement is, and then that best at statement drives the functionality and drives the design of the app. Not, a feature list that somebody hands down and says, we need to do this, and end up doing all of them kind of poorly. Again, the concept of content before Chrome. Really let the content drive the design, not the other way around. So we think about, we've got this grid of tiles, we've got our various products, and you can imagine there might be pictures of the products. It would not be uncommon to find a design where we want to favorite some of the products, or we might want to download a picture or information about a product. We might want to send an email to one of our friends about a product. But the thing about this is we've got a lot of unnecessary clutter to the UX, because it really isn't important to have a button for each of these functions on each of these tiles. Instead, we can make those go away, and then we've got a much clearer and bolder UX, and then we can land those functions down on the app bar and not even necessarily have the user have to discover them. All they have to do is select a given item, and those commands become available automatically. Right? It's a very intuitive user interface, but it's a much cleaner and clearer user interface. All right, so don't think the videos are actually going to play in here, but we'll see if that actually, no, they won't. So Windows 1, again, Windows 1 is really about bringing apps together for more success than the single apps can have on their own. I think the best really the best example of the Windows 1 model is the idea behind contracts. So contracts allow apps to work with the operating system to perform certain tasks like search, like settings. But the one that's really key, I think, is share. So the share contract comes in two parts. There's a share source contract, which says my app has information to share. And the way that this works is your app implements this contract, and you choose, do I have pictures to share? Do I have text to share? What do I have to share? So you take all that stuff that you have to share and you stick it into a container that the operating system gives you. The operating system then receives that and gives to the user options of every single app on their system that knows how to work with any of that information. So what that means is that you have the ability then to communicate with apps that your app doesn't necessarily even know exists. Right? A good example of this that was a completely unexpected sharing opportunity. I have an app called Community Megaphone. One of the things that I do in that app is I promote local events throughout the US for IT pros and developers. As a part of that app, I pull down map tiles for the location of each event that's an in-person event. if I share that particular event, one of the things that I share is that map tile. Well, it turns out there's an app called Puzzle Touch. The app Puzzle Touch knows how to take any given image that you provide it and turn it into a jigsaw puzzle. So if I shared from Community Megaphone into Puzzle Touch, I could create a puzzle out of the map tile. Now, map tile may not be a very interesting puzzle, but when it comes to things like your family photos, imagine discovering that, oh, hey, I've got this app that can make puzzles for my kids from a picture of me that I sent from being on the road. Right? Those are kind of really fortuitous sharing opportunities that are kind of cool. All right. So that's the design principles. So where are we today? One of the things that Microsoft Design has coalesced into is this idea of a consistent design principle across multiple platforms. So if we look at, for example, Windows Phone, we've got the idea of the live tiles, the bold color, the use of typography. Right? This is descended from Windows Media Center and Zune HD and so on. The Lumia 900, I've got the Lumia 920, another expression of that. The Lumia phones are just a beautiful expression of that design style. The new Xbox 360 dashboard also uses that tiled interface, the bold typography, the twist kind of interface. Microsoft.com, they pulled the idea of the tiles in there as well. Then Windows 8 is really sort of the most modern and sophisticated execution of this Microsoft design principle. So again, when you look at the lock screen for a Windows 8 device, big, bright, bold photography, bold typography, information at the ready, right? Before I ever log into my machine, I can see I've got 9 emails, I've got some text messages, I've got my next appointment coming up, I've got the time and date. Live tiles, I've got information about the things that are important to me, whether that be my email program, whether that be a calendar, whether that be a weather application. All of these things are available to me all the time without necessarily having to open an application just to get that information. Again, the idea of the silhouette, right? So these are some kind of some sample apps that we had shipped early on in the development cycle, but you can see there are very different UI designs in each of these apps, but they each follow a very similar silhouette. All right, so the call to action, head over to design.windows.com. There are lots and lots of white papers. There are guidelines for moving from, if you're familiar with iOS design or web design, for making that move from those platforms to the Windows 8 platform. Use the templates and controls that we ship. If you have developers, tell them they need to partner with a designer. Right? I say this to developers all the time. I know from personal experience, developers are not designers. I'm a developer who cares about design,